ビデオ
1988 was the breakout year for one Koichi Ohata. Born on July 26, 1962 in the Aichi prefecture of Japan, Ohata had always been fascinated with the art of sci-fi and fantasy. He was a self-taught artist, and by the age of 21, he was getting gigs at various animation studios as a mecha designer. Most of his works were just mixtures of various mecha series designed to sell toys, which ultimately fell into obscurity. That is, unless names like Lightspeed Electroid Albagus, Video Warrior Laserion, or Ninja Robots ring any bells to you. But 1988 was the year a lot of big name projects got released that had Ohata's name in the credits. First and least was Project Echo 3, where Ohata designed the mechas. I say least because this is the point where many fans agree that the jokes of the Echo franchise are beginning to wear thin. Then there was Mobile Suit Gundam, Char's Counterattack, Sunrise's big stinking movie to conclude the series-spanning rivalry between characters Amuro Ray and Char Aznable. Ohata also designed the mecha for this, but his involvement is up to debate, to the point where the Wikipedia has him credited as design cooperation, whatever that means. But all of that would pale in comparison to the robot designs Ohata did for a little studio called Gainax. If there was one big accomplishment Ohata did in the 80s, it was designing the titular Gunbuster from the 1988 OVA of the same name. A giant robot that practically spans galaxies. Its very presence radiates awesome power via its thick limbs, towering shoulders, and the sharp features adorning its head. And that's even before we see it in action, where it displays its might, wiping out scores of cosmic monstrosities by the thousands. It is one of the premier mecha designs of the 1980s, and one that continues to influence other larger-than-life giant robots to this very day. So with all the successful projects he had been given to this point, it almost seems expected that Ohata was given the chance to pitch an original idea for an OVA. This was still the wheelin' and dealin' Japan of the 80s, where producers would patiently entertain the ideas of even the lowliest of animation staff and then throw some modest budget their way. I mean, they had the money, it wasn't going anywhere. So pitch Ohata did, and by 1989, he was making his directorial debut.
共に祈ろう。選ばれし肉体に奇跡の起こらんことを。暴力と破壊の王、サルドーの名にかけて。
In the far dystopian future of this year, a research pilot by the name of John Stalker is asked to test the latest mecha pilot suit with specialized psychic powers to safely and non-lethally reduce crime in the city of Cyberwood, specifically the poor district known as the Cancer Slums. But, like you would expect, things don't go exactly to plan when rival scientist Adler decides to sabotage John's demonstration. Both so as more violent methods of crime reduction are used, as well as a chance to steal away John's lady friends. But, by sheer coincidence, an eviler wind blows John's way, and he soon becomes a pawn in the evil machinations of the apocalyptic cult known as the Brethren of Doldo. They see John as the true harbinger of doom, and gladly bestow on him an amazingly powerful set of giant robot armor to do their bidding against his will. It all comes down to John to break free of the cult and put a stop to their plans while still avoiding a relentless Adler who still wants him dead. Or to put it in less complicated terms, think King Kong meets Frankenstein meets RoboCop with a little dash of Devilman in between it. It's been a hot minute since we covered an anime like Cybernetics Guardian. For too long, we've been covering classics, underrated gems, or anime that are just good in spite of their flaws. Today, we need to gather some perspective in covering a good old-fashioned pile of mediocrity. You know how in my last video I talked about how Ninja Scroll was often lumped in with the glut of ultraviolent trash that was currently flooding the VHS shelves? Well, trash day is here, my compadres. Despite the overly complicated summary a few paragraphs ago, Cybernetics Guardian's premise could have actually worked in a 40-minute format. Guy gets robot suit, kicks some ass, defeats the bad guy, gets the girl, end the story. Simple story, but one that could be memorable if given a good enough presentation. And to Cybernetics Guardian's credit, it does at least try on that front. But somewhere along the way, Cybernetics Guardian ends up tripping down 10 flights of stairs and winds up as a pile of twisted metal nonsense at the bottom of the stairwell. And yet, Ohata still managed to get plenty of work after this debut. By all means, it sold well enough to warrant him being allowed to direct other passion projects even after the bubble economy burst. So are we missing something that Cybernetics Guardian is throwing? Or maybe we're deliberately dodging it? Whatever the case is, let's pop the hood on this piece of hyperviolence and examine its various innards. One thing I can say about Cybernetics Guardian is that it knows how to capture your attention from the very beginning. Ohata must have taken some cues from Yoshiaki Kawajiri because he knows how to hit you with a striking image to pull you into the anime. The example here being a giant robot demon skeleton hanging from a crucifix. If any of this aesthetic looks familiar to some people in the audience, that would be because of Ohata drawing inspiration from another project that he not only worked on as a mecha designer, but also has his first animation directing credits, namely the infamous 1986 OVA MD Geist, aka the example of hyperviolent schlock anime. We'll get to that shit circus some other day, but it's pertinent to know that MD Geist was the grimdark seed from which Ohata's creative tree sprang forth. The whole atmosphere is this grim, gritty hellscape of broken concrete and complex machinery, all set to the cheesiest and most 80s of cheesy 80s metal. Music was provided by Japanese hair metal group Trash Gang. Their debut album also served as Cybernetics Guardian's official soundtrack. And I'm sure it was the first step in a long-esteemed career. Well, regardless, I think Trash Gang's brand of squealing guitars and shrieking vocals fits Cybernetics Guardian's overall tone. The grim and gritty atmosphere is not grim and gritty because everything is morose and depressing, despite its best efforts. It's grim and gritty because it's metal as all get out. And it kind of helps that there are a lot of scene compositions that are set up simply so they can better sync up with the music. But if there's one element of Cybernetics Guardian that deserves the most praise, it would be the mecha design. I mean, obviously, right? Ohata is a mecha designer by trade, of course he would draw good mecha. John Stalker as the titular Guardian does look very visually striking. It has the look of a primal gorilla wearing the noble armor of a knight, and it's a design that's very flexible in how it can be portrayed. When it's going on a violent rampage on behalf of the evil cult, it looks like this unstoppable juggernaut, an obvious force of evil and destruction that makes everyone powerless in its wake. But when John Stalker regains his free will and starts using his powers to save his girlfriend, the armor begins to shine and begins to look less like a feral beast and more like a heroic warrior in ornate armor. It almost emphasizes John's humanity in the face of an opponent who is way more heartless machinery than he is. And you just know it leads to an awesome fight scene. But aside from the mecha battles, the animation is very indicative of its low budget. It's understandable that you need to know when and where to use your budgets, especially in projects like this where the amount is so limited. But the animation rarely feels consistent. Like, there's flourishes peppered throughout, but you have to end up wading through a lot of scenes where uninspired character designs sit in a room and jabber with each other in the stiffest, most visually uninteresting way ever. Which ties us into the story of Cybernetics Guardian. And this is where it gets fun, folks. So let's briefly go back to my Ninja Scroll video and draw comparisons between it and Cybernetics Guardian and how they do their story. Ninja Scroll's story, while simplistic and lacking in anything particularly deep or thematic, is by and large the stronger of the two. Characters' motivations are clear, the stakes are high and make themselves known, and everything is perfectly connected into one cohesive narrative. Cybernetics Guardian, on the other hand, is an amorphous blob of a story. Everything is constantly shifting and morphing from one plot point to the other with little to no care on how they connect. Let me pull back the curtain and tell you my experience with Cybernetics Guardian. So when I actually sat down to watch Cybernetics Guardian for the sake of this review, I did so in the comfort of my own bed. It was only 40 minutes long and I figured I could watch it before bed easily. Little did I know, I was feeling particularly sleepier than I usually was and soon found myself fading in and out of consciousness, just trying my best to pay attention to whatever madness was happening on the screen. So when the OVA ended, I decided I should just rewatch it in the morning when I was more awake. Next morning, I wake up, shower, eat a hearty breakfast with a cup of coffee, and sit down ready to rewatch Cybernetics Guardian with a set of fresh eyes. And do you know what happened? It played out exactly how I remembered it when I was half asleep. It was with a slow dawning sense of horror that Cybernetics Guardian makes just as much sense as it does when you're in a half-lidded fugue state, as it does when you're wide awake and fresh as a daisy. Nothing about this story flows. Scenes fade in and out from each other with just the barest narrative connection. There are several instances where a scene will play out and then come to a sudden realization that it has no idea how to end, so it just goes to another scene. Like this scene, for example, with Adler trying to put the moves on John's fiancée while also trying to pump her for information on John's possible location. Seems to be playing out normally until the fiancée drops a huge bombshell about how John was born in the cancer slums, and then bam, they're in the car heading to the slums and continuing their conversation like no time had passed between those two scenes. Or how about a scene earlier when John makes a big escape from the cultists and is limping down an alleyway only to be confronted by a detective who sees him as a person of interest. But just when John's about to give out his information, the cult teleports behind him and literally pulls him out of the scene like they were the game master trying to railroad the plot back on the tracks. But even if this anime was a perfectly paced story that had a natural flow, it doesn't change the fact that half of the story is conveyed through endless exposition dumps. So much of this anime is devoted to explaining the plot rather than letting it unfold naturally. One character will be talking to another, giving them the SparksNotes summary of the anime, and having them react to these series of backstory and revelations like how the staff would want the audience to react to it. The story honestly feels like an afterthought because while these scenes are going on, they weave in scenes of John decapitating politicians and wrecking the police force's shit, and it makes it look like that's where your focus should be. If there was a top 5 list of the priorities Ohata had for Cybernetics Guardian, at the very bottom would be 5 other priorities, followed by the story. It's just so haphazardly implemented from the way it flows, the way it tells its story, and it just feels like an excuse to get from action set piece to action set piece. And I know what you're thinking. Of course it's shallow and haphazard. It's a 40-minute OVA. It only has so much time to work with. But let's compare this to another short OVA we've covered on this show.
Please call me tonight.
Call Me Tonight is 10 minutes shorter than Cybernetics Guardian, and yet at the same time has a stronger story. That's because it knows how to use its time wisely by knowing when and where to introduce important plot points and having those plot points gel into a cohesive whole. It also doesn't waste time dwelling on exposition or explaining character backstory because it knows how to show you who these characters are via their interactions and how they respond to their environment. And I get that Cybernetics Guardian is a more complex story because it has to do a little more world building with its setting than Call Me Tonight, but considering how little time they spend building that world, it's no excuse. Ohata seems like a guy who's interested way more in themes rather than story. Despite being kinda sort of a mess, there are some themes to be found in Cybernetics Guardian. One of the more reoccurring ones found in Ohata's work is man's relationship with machinery. Machinery being portrayed as this all-encompassing destructive force, one that completely transformed fragile human beings into gamma-powered mechanical monsters with freeway on-ramps for arms and hearts as black as coal against their will. Tying into this is Cybernetics Guardian's theme of class warfare. The story centers around the urban blight and the cancer slums, and the big question on everyone's mind in Cyberwood is, how do we fix that problem? On one side, we have John Stalker. He represents the lower classes, being that he is a man who fought his way up from said slums and got into a position of authority. Therefore, he wants to use this authority to push for non-lethal crime enforcement to make the slums livable again.
アルファプロジェクトの委員会には必ず認めさせてみせるわ。
そうですよ、アドラーさん。無法地帯のキャンサーをきっと救えるはずです。
Personally, I would push for more government programs, better housing, and get to the root of some societal problems rather than jamming people into jail. But we'll do it your way, cop. On the other side, we have Adler. He represents the upper classes who see the people in poverty as a lower life form that needs to be exterminated for the betterment of Cyberwood. And when I mean exterminate, I mean full-blown nuke them from orbit. He wants poor people dead, and he wants them dead yesterday. At the midpoint, his entire character motivation switches from kill John to steal his girlfriend to kill John because he was born in the slums.
よくこの俺を欺いたな。キャンサーのゴミ野郎め。その報い、たった今受けさせてやる。
It all culminates in him forsaking his human body and merging with his own death machine, all just to kill this one guy for the crime of being born poor, and then plans to enact his one-man class genocide on the entire slums after that. The Republican Party wishes they were on this guy's level, but Cybernetics Guardian never really seems to engage with its own themes. Its themes of class warfare are barely touched on because we never get a good look at how bad the slums are, or if it's the fault of the politicians or corporations making it that way. And the only characters from the slum that we spend the lion's share amount of screen time with are the cult, and they seem to be only interested in bringing forth the apocalypse. The only non-cult members of the slum we see are a random shot of people who cheer when a cop car gets blown up. The class warfare stuff is only there to make Adler an even more evil villain than he already was, because if it truly mattered, we would have had an ending where John utilized his newfound control of his powers and used it to become a defender of the waste. Instead, the ending is just John and his fiancée on the lam from their former employers, while the cult plans for their next attack in the shadows, so much for that. And it's doubly stupid when you consider the other theme of Cybernetics Guardian about the power of technology and how it can be harnessed. John, though lacking in a lot of character, has a very clear motivation as the hero in that he wants to help people. So when he is kidnapped by the Brethren of Doldo, it turns into a horrific tragedy where John is given all this power and in turn forced to commit horrific acts of violence and terrorism against his will. It ultimately leads to what I assume to be the emotional climax of the anime, where he finishes a violent rampage and has a brief moment of clarity where he looks out at the damage he caused.
本当にこの機械でキャンサーを救えるんですね。
そうよ。人の正しい意志が生命を力に導くのよ。
僕の命がキャンサーを救う。What am I fighting for?
So later, when he actually gains control of his powers and turns against the cult through the power of love, I guess, it should be a moment of triumph. A human being who was given the powers of a mechanical demon has now regained his free will and now uses his powers for good instead of evil. I'm sure after he kills Adler in the big climax, he can then use his powers for the betterment of the people of set up sequel, roll credits, end of anime, done. The themes, like every other non-presentation part of this anime, is just set dressing. It's only there to make an anime devoted to two monstrous machine men wailing on each other seem a whole lot deeper than it actually is. So Cybernetics Guardian is a bad anime, without question. Its story amateurish, its characters one-dimensional, and its themes tacked on. It's the anime equivalent of a 90s image comic, a simplistic story that's only there to string together scenes of violence and characters beating each other up. But you can't deny that there's something endearing about it all. I mean, it's bad, but it's an enjoyable brand of bad that could have only been derived from bad ultraviolet anime from the 80s. It's got blood, it's got giant robots, and it's got loud hair metal oozing from every orifice. It's the perfect appetizer for any old school bad anime night, and that's why I'd say it's worth at least one look. And considering how Central Park Media overestimated the demand for these types of animes, DVDs of this are super easy to get a hold of. But remember, if you pay more than $15 for this schlock, you're getting ripped off. As for Koichi Ohata, he fared quite well after this debut, and it proved to be the stepping stone for which he could make such masterpieces as... and And
Burst Angel.
this won't be the last we see of Koichi Ohata.